Good afternoon, everybody. How do I sound? Good. As some of you may know, and as some of you might not know, I'm Talman Joseph Smith. I'm a New York Times economics reporter, and I'll be the moderator today for this discussion that I think is complex and urgent and important and appropriately contentious. I'll just start by reading off some of the written remarks I have here, and then we'll hop into the real conversation. And the Federal Reserve has a tough job. It has, as we all know here, two mandates that many but not all economists see as being inherently in tension with one another. It operates as the key actor of macroeconomic management for the globe's largest economy, and in many aspects, let's be honest, for the globe at large. And above all, it is constantly under political pressure from all sides. Some see that as a problem. For me and my reporting, I simply see it as a feature, not a bug, because the job of the Fed is in many senses inescapably political. Just like our tax system, right? Our immigration system, our regulatory system, and on and on and on, our education system, each wonky maneuver is imbued with social implications and social assumptions. And so with that, as we sit here a year and some change, right, into the Federal Reserve's latest cycle of hiking interest rates in an attempt to slow the economy and inflation, in their words, there are two questions before us. Number one, what is the Fed going to do next? And on that front, who knows? The discourse, right, has gone from, are you kidding me, 3 massive banks have just failed, they're definitely done hiking, to the disinflationary process has been unacceptably slow, so they're gonna hike again. And now we're in the dizzying parallel universe of dovish hikes and hawkish pauses, and they'll skip and then maybe do something else in July, and then they'll cut or they won't, right? On and on. So we'll talk about that a little bit, but I think we'll also talk a bit about number two, which is what, according to the luminaries that we have here, I think, what should the Fed do and what should it have done? And more broadly, what should we do as a country next time around when we face a price shock? So I look forward to hearing all those possible reimaginations with you all. And with that, I want to introduce our panelists. First off, we have Mr. Rakeem Mahmood. Dr. Mahmood is the chief economist and managing director of policy and research at the Groundwork Collaborative. She's obviously a nationally respected policy expert. She's played a key role in Groundwork's pioneering effort to publicize the role of corporate profits and how that plays into inflation. No victory lapping. Or maybe baby victory lap. Mike Consul is the director of macroeconomic analysis at the Roosevelt Institute. He is the author of Freedom from the Market, America's Fight to Liberate Itself from the Grip of the Invisible Hand, and a co-author with Joseph Stiglitz, who we all know here, of Rewriting the Rules of the American Economy. He also makes great Twitter threads. And last but not least, we have David Stein, who is an assistant professor of history at University of California, Santa Barbara, and a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. David researches and writes about economic policy as well, the civil rights movement, what full employment means, what inflation management means, and he's currently completing his first book, Fearing Inflation, Inflating Fears, the Civil Rights Struggle for Full Employment and the Rise of the Carceral State. And I'll just note, and I'm sure we'll get into this, that the legacy of Coretta Scott is crucial to macroeconomic policy, and that's a piece of trivia, and it probably should not be, and I think your book will do a good job of righting that wrong. So without further ado, I'd like to clean up my papers here and get into the first question, which, if it's okay with you all, I'll go to my colleague, Lydia DePillis, who recently, or not too long ago, wrote an article with the headline, Is Greedflation Rewriting Economics, or do the old rules still apply? Obviously, people at large have come to hate that term, greedflation, and kind of come up with their own, because there's this great point that everybody makes in response to hearing greedflation, besides it being a sort of weird portmanteau of, did corporations suddenly get greedy in 2021? The answer, of course, is no. And so now we have, what, 6, 5, 7 terms instead? That's maybe a more interesting question. But to just knock it off and sort of go to you guys, to the extent that we know a significant amount of inflation can be attributed to extraordinary margin expansion or extraordinary margin protection, what does that say about how, going forward, we should look at our inflation tools, and to what extent do interest rate hikes fight against them? Do they operate parallel to them? Does it have no effect at all, really? And so that leaves the only other options for managing price increases in other realms. What do you all think? And Rakeen, I'll start with you.
Big question to start with. Thank you, Talvin, for moderating this conversation. I'm really looking forward to speaking with wonderful colleagues I've been working with for many years now. So I think your question really gets at, like, what is the source of inflation, right? And are interest rates the right tool conditional on what actually causes and drives inflation? And what we have seen over and over again over the last year and a half, 2 years, is that the traditional explanations for what causes prices to go up and rise at a fast rate are simply not holding water, right? It's not excessive wages driving inflation. It's not too much stimulus driving inflation. I and everyone on this table probably can tell you all the research that goes into that and validates that. But we are seeing, the standard story of too much demand chasing too few goods. That's not holding up, right? So the question that I have then is, well, why do we have too few goods in the first place? And you mentioned greedflation. Corporate greed or corporate profiteering is a phenomenon that we've seen over the last 18 months or so. Over and over and over on corporate earnings calls, we hear CEOs, CFOs, other corporate executives just literally crowing about what a great opportunity it is to raise prices beyond what their input costs would justify, right? Beyond what it takes to actually produce the product, and make record profits. And that's exactly what we saw, right? In 2022, we saw record corporate profit margins. But that, to me, is like the tip of the iceberg, right? We see corporations able to profiteer because of a series of policy choices that we've made over the course of decades. Policy choices that have really allowed bigness in our economy, right? We have a lot of really big companies that control the production of essential goods and services, mostly goods in the case of this particular period of inflation. And they have used that bigness, they have used that power that they hold in the economy to shape systems, shape supply chains, shape our broader economic system in a way that works for them, right? And we can get into what that looks like, right? That looks like really, really knife-edge supply chains that break down as soon as a crisis hits. It looks like erosion of labor standards so that workers are being paid less and less and less and less so that they can save some money, and workers who are literally the ones who are paying the price at the grocery store can't afford those goods, right? So I think greedflation, whether or not you like the term, I agree it's a little silly, but I do think it's a symptom of a broader set of problems and a broader power imbalance that we're seeing in our economy.
Mike, I know you might want to go next just because you have been at the center of, I think, debates in terms of, almost taking a look at the pie of inflation and people saying, okay, well, how much of this is, corporate profits? How much of this is, average hourly earnings being at a, really robust rate, and on and on and on, right? I think there's about 6 things that go into that pie. For you, how much of what Rakeen has just told us about is in that pie, right? The push of profits or the protection of them in a way that is extraordinary compared to other periods, and how much in reality is it these other factors, flush consumers and flush businesses and so on, the idea of price insensitivity.
Yeah, can you hear me okay? So the first thing I'd note is that as an empirical matter, inflation is reflected in corporate profits. This is well known. So I use the verb reflected very consciously here because it doesn't imply causation. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need to know who chose what in what way. Just to reflect that this is not a labor story phenomena. This is not a story of too high wages or too low unemployment driving inflation. And this is also a story about what one of the solutions can be to inflation, which is compression of profit margins. Administratively, through competition policy, through job owning, through many other tools we have. It's very tough to tell from the aggregate data because we can only see certain numbers in real time. the causal mechanisms here, but we do know that it's reflected there. Now, we at Roosevelt have done some cross-section studies using public filings of corporations, and we found that, there's definitely a lot of spending in the economy. Margins and markups, profits are up kind of across the board. We know there's definitely a supply story. We see certain sectors particularly impacted, as we'd expect, as we had this huge shift from goods to services, from services to goods and then back again, combined with huge global shocks to food and energy supply chains. But even when you control for all those, we do see that firms that had higher markups before the pandemic increase their margins even further. Enough that it could account for a sizable amount of the inflation we've seen in 2021 in particular. Now, people will debate these questions for a generation, but in terms of where we're at right now, where inflation, though it's come down a large amount, is still a little elevated from where we'd like it to be, it shows that there's more tools than just interest rate hikes. There's things to address supply chains and crucially things to address profit margins. We do see through other mechanisms the fact that there is this divergence between the prices that producers pay and the prices that consumers pay, so-called price inflation, another term along with seller's inflation, an old term that's been resurrected by Isabella Weber recently. It's not necessarily winning a specific debate about the cause per se, but addressing what solutions are available in real time and what different actors can make of it, because there's a variety of reasons the Federal Reserve and other kind of economic gatekeepers want to keep the set of tools really gatekept at the Fed and within their profession. But if things like FTC policy, if things like strategic energy policy could make a real dent in inflation, those are things we should absolutely be taking advantage of.
Yeah, I think that's smart, and I want to dedicate a whole chunk of this to the what should we do next / what should we do towards the tail end of whatever excessive inflation we have left right now. But to get you in here, David, a lot of what sort of circles this discussion that isn't necessarily about hard numbers and PCE deflators and on and on and on. It's about really deep questions like what is full employment and what is price stability. And as you look at your work that you're working on currently, focused on the 20th century, when for a long time people thought 5%, that's full employment. Now, almost just by decree of the late 2010s, we know that wasn't quite true. So what do you make of those questions of what is full employment and what is price stability in the context of the 20th century and our current context?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'd say firstly that when the civil rights activists, A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, Coretta Scott King, when they're organizing the March on Washington, and then later in terms of Coretta Scott King, her coalition, the National Committee for Full Employment, when they say full employment, they didn't mean 4%, 5% overall unemployment, which would mean 8%, 9%, 10% black unemployment. That wasn't what they were fighting for. They were fighting for, as they put it, zero involuntary unemployment, and that attended to where people were located. So uneven geographic development was an important issue that they were attended to. Also, what was going on in different industries. And when they fought for and helped solidify what became the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, that was how they imagined it. And the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, of course, says, unemployment should be reduced to 3%, and that should be attendant to labor market groups who face different kinds of discrimination, including the elderly, including African American workers, including transgender workers, including workers with criminal legal system involvement. So that is the law of the land. That is not how the Fed or other institutions have interpreted or enforced that law, which, as every civil rights activist knows, enforcement of the law is a key component of solidifying the victories that were already won in legislation, which I'll leave it there and tell another story about the history later.
No, you should. And when I think about the immediately the era that immediately follows, what you're talking about, Humphrey Hawkins, I think about the Volcker shock and how with uneven success in success is a word. Others wouldn't define it as success, right? He on his own terms and on the terms of the Fed at that time did get success, with great pain, right? Of double-digit unemployment at one point and slightly higher for some of the groups that you're talking about, including Black Americans. But what I find fascinating is when Volcker left office, unemployment was actually still slightly above 4%. When Reagan ran for re-election in 1984, the classic Morning in America re-election campaign, inflation, as judged by the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, in the mid-4s, which is kind of where we are with PCE now, right? So that's a little bit of apples to oranges, but it's still in the same ballpark. And so this is a question that I guess all three of you could take in whatever order. Maybe David, you could go first, but I mean, is it just that Americans were so used to very, very high inflation, higher than we have now, so we were all just relieved to get down to the mid-4s? Was it that actually the mid-4s weren't so bad and we've forgotten that because we've been spoiled by globalization and technology that have made especially goods just dirt cheap compared to what they were? And regardless of what your answer is there, I guess there's a secondary one that I just want to leave you all with, which is is there a trade-off at all between inflation and employment? Some people think to say that there isn't is wishful thinking. And I just want to know what you all make of that. So a complicated two-pronged question, but take it as you will.
Well, I guess to start off, one thing that's important to emphasize as we're talking about the Humphrey-Hawkins Act is the Humphrey-Hawkins Act calls for reasonable price stability. So, by that metric, the kind of relatively stable 4% of the mid-1980s certainly, I think qualifies. Volcker wanted 0% in inflation. So, in the same way that Fed Chair Powell currently holds 2% as a talisman, Volcker held 0% as a talisman, and Volcker, was very much guided by a single mandate rather than the dual mandate. So, as he put it in a 2013 interview, I am against the dual mandate. I do not remember the word dual mandate ever passing my lips in all my time that I was chairman. So similarly, Augustus Hawkins, who literally wrote the bill, was saying, sounding the alarm in 1979, 1980, saying, that the law that bore his name, quote, explicitly prohibits using unemployment as a trade-off to reduce inflation. So to your kind of second question, the Fed certainly thinks that there's a trade-off, and whether, where we stand on that issue, I think, yeah, we can discuss that, but the Fed certainly thinks that there's a trade-off and has acted like it historically, both before the Volcker shock and after the Volcker shock.
Can I jump in? I mean, I want to continue to push on the very light skepticism you put like success in air quotes, right? The Volcker shock was a freaking disaster, y'all. Like, it put Black Americans into a depression, a depression. I mean, you know the numbers better than I do. Yeah, go ahead, illuminate.
So, June 1983, the unemployment rate for Black men 20 years old and older was 19%. 17% for Black women, a staggering 52% for younger Black workers.
So is that success? Like, if we're putting a giant chunk of our economy, especially folks who are always on the margins of well-being and prosperity, into a deep, deep, deep recession just to bring prices down, that's not success, right? That's not how I define success. I don't think that's how we should collectively be defining economic health. And, inflation matters because it is fundamentally a sort of wonky way of talking about cost of living, right? It's about whether or not people can go to the grocery store and buy food for their kids, put diapers on babies' butts, and put some school supplies in their kids' backpack. Or if you don't have kids, if you can buy your new TV, whatever it is, right? And so if we're putting millions and millions and millions and millions of people out of work to achieve lower prices, that is not success. So I do think that we need to sort of break free of that trade-off. Like, we can either have low prices or we can have low unemployment. And in particular, that feels really salient right now because we are in a moment where we're not seeing that trade-off, right? We're seeing a really healthy labor market. We saw 339,000 jobs last month. That is remarkable. We've seen a recovery that has been basically V-shaped, right? And that is precisely because the government has taken steps to invest in people, to put money in people's pockets, to get them through this crisis, and put them first, right? They didn't put prices first. They didn't put big banks first, like Mike and some of his colleagues were talking about in the 2 recessions panels earlier. So I just, I do think that, to answer your question, yes, it is possible to break free of that false trade-off, and we're actually seeing that play out in real time. That being said, and I'm sure we'll get into this, I don't think we should get complacent about it. I mean, in the same way that we saw, black unemployment hit the lowest point in recorded history 2 months ago, last month it started to tick back up, and it was a statistically significant jump, 0.9 percentage points. That is, I would argue, we're starting to see the effects of the Fed's actions and the actions they've been taking over the last 10 months. So I do think it's important to ask why we're even having this conversation, right? And it's like, at the end of the day, the question we're all grappling with is, does a healthy economy look like one where millions of people are put out of work in order to bring down prices? And for me, the answer is no, and I think the Volcker shock is a particularly extreme manifestation of that.
If I can jump in on that. I'm really glad you brought up the inflation rate at the mid-late 1980s, which is somewhat comparable to where it is now, because it's really important we define what success looks like. And why does this question matter? Well, it matters, one, because the Fed might cause a recession, which would devastate millions of people's lives and put the economy back on the back foot. In addition to that, it would be a referendum on everything that has happened in response to this pandemic, where obviously not sufficient in many ways and not permanent enough in even more ways, but the big fiscal impulse and the big administrative impulse to get cash to people, support families, give life-changing unemployment insurance to people, stop evictions and foreclosures. That will all be remembered as a failure if the forces of reaction get their way in defining what is happening right now with inflation. Depending on, inflation is coming down. There's a question of how rapidly it's going to come down and what level it's going to come down. But the fact that it is in ranges consistent with the 1980s and 1990s where we saw success is quite important. So the question is, like, is there a trade-off? People even debate whether or not there's a trade-off under Volcker. The oil shock rolled off quite a bit in the early 1980s in the same way the energy shock has rolled off to some extent in the United States, less so in other countries. The reopening shock has rolled off as quite a bit. If we were in some ways too expansive, you wouldn't expect to see wages decelerating to still a very high level, but coming down, which is not consistent with this theory of trade-offs. You wouldn't see the labor market softening to a solid, but not the labor market we associate with a rapid reopening, where people are switching careers quite rapidly in response to just the massive changes in the economy. That wouldn't be consistent with the idea that we're in this strict trade-off era. One of the trade-offs people worry about is the kind of attention of when inflation is in the news and when inflation is very salient to people. When inflation is, say, 5 or 6, 6, 7, 8, or 9% as it was in early 2022. People anticipate a little bit more, maybe they react a little bit more to it, and this is a very important part of the theory. If you look now, inflation's not as much of a political priority as it's fallen off to essentially 4 ranges, and particularly as energy and food prices have come down. So, the things that would make me more worried we were in the strict trade-off world to the extent it exists haven't been the story of the last 9 months. And to the extent we might end up in there, it would be in a position where inflation is even lower than it is now, at which point you really want to talk about the trade-offs of putting millions of people to be unemployed to get to an inflation target that's functionally made up, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit.
Yeah, I'd love to. And to your point about, presumed trade-offs versus real trade-offs and the sort of gray matter, black matter, really, I should say, in between, where it's like, we don't really know. It was considered so hopeful, so unlikely at one point that we could get from 9 to sort of just below 5 or at 5 in terms of, inflation, that it was widely called immaculate disinflation. I think I literally might have put that in the story, right? So accountability, sorry. But as we go forward, right, there is this idea, and Mike, I'll kick it back to you, and then, and Rakeen, I'd like to hear your take. Have we squeezed all the juice we can out of the immaculate disinflation lemon? Are we, I don't mean to repeat the question, but I mean, is it that if we're just patient enough, if we, not to get too much into the data, but if the sort of year-over-year base effects are favorable enough, the rate of change will slow down enough that if we're patient, we'll get to 2-ish, high 2, and we can all, just cool it and talk about, structural policy stuff again. Or should we wrestle with maybe we do need to get average hourly earnings to 3% or in that range again to ensure that inflation expectations, which a lot of economists point to, don't become unanchored. Because that is really rampant sort of throughout this whole conversation. This sort of wonky but like incredibly important idea in economic policy circles, including on Wall Street, that you can't let this go on for too long at 3 because, well, what if you get a mini shock and then you're back up to 5, and what if, and on and on. So take that.
Yeah, so I'll just put my cards on the table, what I thought was going to happen, what happened. So you can do different ways of measuring things, but speaking generally, inflation a year ago, a year and a half ago in particular, was about 6 to 9%. We thought, or we kind of made an argumentative bet that between things reopening, energy and food policy normalizing, the labor market normalizing to a good labor market as opposed to one that involves a lot of reallocation that was sectoral coming out of the pandemic. That as corporate profits started to, the margins started to compress, maybe we can go into that debate live about how much they're compressing, but it seems on non-financials they're coming down quite a bit, or at least a little bit, that we thought inflation would probably come down to about 3, maybe 3.5, at which point, why do we care if it's 3 or 2? It's a made-up distinction. Notably, in 2019, people like Larry Summers were arguing for targets that were consistent with inflation being 3 to 4%. A lot of people called, Jason Furman called for a 4% inflation target. Other people were calling for NGDP targets, which are related. But essentially, everyone thought that 2% was too low to prevent these kind of herky-jerky. Either we have long, prolonged jobless recoveries, or these kind of sudden spikes in spending. And that's something that's more in a range that is much more consistent with many peer countries that have just as good, if not better, macroeconomic stabilization. So we were hoping, get down to 3, 3.5, declare victory, and just argue like it is not worth the trade-off to go lower, to the extent that the trade-off is just the Fed's going to like rip wires out of the wall until the lights shut off, which is basically what its policy is. Now it's leveled down to about 4 to 5 has been brought up. It's higher than what we wanted. I think there's still a case for optimism. Housing prices have not fully been incorporated into the data. The goods markets has a lot of normalization to do, notably with automobiles. I think there's still a case that it will come down towards 3. If it stayed where it is, we have to think a little bit more concretely, though notably nothing is increasing in such a way that people should be worried about it. Spending isn't increasing on a nominal basis. Wages are not skyrocketing just to keep pace with price increases that would then kind of spiral if, at least in the economist story, if that ever really happens outside of very extreme circumstances. So I still think there's a case for an optimism towards a soft landing that would be enough to declare victory and say, are you really going to put millions and millions of people out of work to hit this made up kind of fairy tale number? And there's nothing that makes me think the situation is getting worse. And it's been months and months of people predicting that, and that has not happened at any point. And you don't even see that no matter how you slice it. So
recession calls are never wrong, Mike. They're just early.
I was looking at this for something like there was 100% recession call among Bloomberg economists in like September 2022, and I don't think the economists have the right story on this whatsoever. And I think when we don't know that, and we do know the bad things are contained, and maybe not as bad as they were at this level, and the good things are quite good, why not be patient and see what's going to happen?
So I want to get at the part of your question where you asked, when can we get back to debating structural factors, right? Because I do think we should be debating structural factors now. I mean, Isabella Weber's paper work that Mike mentioned earlier, she argues that we live in a time of overlapping emergencies. We have a pandemic, we have a war, we have a supply chain crisis, we have climate change, we're all breathing in smog. All of the above is happening, and it's going to continue to happen. And we know from examining the past bout of inflation, this current bout of inflation, that it is precisely those emergencies that big corporations took advantage of and hid behind in order to jack up prices and gain record profits, all while people were left holding the bag. Right? So if we continue to see these crises, if we continue to see a series of excuses that these big companies can use to bring prices up for everyday people, then I would argue that we actually need to address those things that give those big companies power right now, right? Because we talk about the economy, we talk about the inflation, we talk about prices like it's the weather, like it just happens to us. It doesn't happen to us, right? It is a policy choice. Everything that we're seeing right now is a policy choice. Big companies having the power to jack up prices is a policy choice. Workers not having unions to push back and get a bit of that pie is a policy choice. And so, if we don't want to keep seeing a series of shocks that lead to massive inflation, then we're all debating, should we enter into a recession to bring down prices over and over and over again, then we can get ahead of that problem, right? We can get at some of the things that Mike had started talking about and David had started talking about by addressing some of these bigger power dynamics in our economy. And, I think Mike and I maybe disagree a little bit here because I do think we're starting to see sort of a canary in the coal mine in the labor market. The fact that we saw a 0.9 percentage point increase in black unemployment is not a small thing, right? And we know that black workers are always the first fired, they're always the last hired, they're always the folks who are going to be hit first when we're entering into an economic downturn, and I'm sure David has a lot to say about that. And I do think we should take that seriously. We shouldn't wave it away just because it's not a comfortable thing to be dealing with right now.
Yeah, I'd also add to that, even though this is a very volatile and high-frequency data set, jobless claims were a little bit scary. We'll see. It could easily get revised away, like the Massachusetts jobless claims, which came from fraud, which I didn't even know was possible. But hey, looking to the past so that we can sort of look to the future, which is something we've been hinting at a bit here. Coretta Scott was quietly a huge wonk, it turns out, when it comes to non-interest rate hike solutions to achieving price stability and solving for price shocks. And so, David, if you want to, let us in on some of what her and her coalition back then were talking about to find more, I guess they'd frame it as pro-social ways to tackle this issue, that'd be great.
Yeah, so on the topic of broadening the anti-inflationary or inflation management toolkit, Coretta Scott King and her coalition, the National Committee for Full Employment and the Full Employment Action Council, they were like kind of parallel organizations. They argued for things like targeted anti-inflationary policy that sought to expand supply in bottleneck sectors. They recognized that, energy, they fought for energy conservation and advocated for policies like that. They advocated for expanded housing instead of just, high interest rates, which would reduce supply. They argued for, kind of grain reserves to focus on food costs, because one of the kind of early 1970s inflation, prior to the first oil shock, there was a food price shock. And so again, looking at the actual sources of supply side inflation were very important to her and her coalition, because they saw that the traditional toolkit of jacking up interest rates was inequitable and unfair towards workers of color in particular, but all workers in general. And they saw that in kind of contradiction and directly opposed to what they were fighting for, and so they had to take on inflation by suggesting kind of new tools. So they emphasized that recession is not the answer to, or is not a just or fair answer to inflation.
Yeah. What about some of the I guess really creative stuff that's been starting to kick around, right? There's what I guess is the newest entrant into sort of mainstream, which is changing the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR, into an inflation-fighting tool, right? And I think that's given people a lot of interesting ideas of like, oh, what if we just SPR everything? Which, like, you know, is an interesting thing to think about, even for me as a reporter. But we've also seen, you know, folks like a couple of professors at Cornell talk about, hey, let's bring back Liberty bonds in some cases so that we can, you know, have savings be prioritized. Some people start bringing up like, hey, how about we like bring back the idea of a really aggressive public option so that healthcare costs go into, you know, maybe even deflation for a little bit and we reset that market. Mike, I'll kick this one to you because I know that you've been in some of these conversations. Which of them seem like the best in a vacuum to you? And secondly, which of them seem as if though they'll be politically plausible, even if they need a little bit of a push to become politically plausible?
That's a good question. I'm going to remind everyone I am substituting in for J.W. Mason, so I've not given all of these the full thought. But so a few things that I think are quite important, and Rakeen, I think, can also jump in on this, is where the policy debates are. One is obviously on energy, as people have talked about, and food as well. Housing policy, I think, is a huge part of it. Housing is just a huge part of people's expenses, and as such, it's a huge part of people the way they calculate inflation. And it's something where both the demand and supply of housing is very out of whack of where it could be. You know, there's not enough housing in many places, either public or private, and there are many people who cannot afford housing no matter the level of supply. And so in general, you've seen efforts to try. There's a big Biden bill that sadly didn't go anywhere that would have boosted people's ability to demand housing through housing vouchers, but also increased the supply of private housing. There's been a lot of efforts at local levels to increase social housing. I think that would have quite an impact on the way inflation is calculated and the way people's budgets are adjusted as such. You know, there's been talk about a lot of work around labor boards with particularly service sector workers, and particularly service sector workers that are kind of hard to unionize because of the structure of their labor forces or their maybe contractual kind of non-traditional environments. And I'm not at the frontier of that, but having a staggered wage setting board that would also have an impact on prices is how we, you know, won World War II. It's how we've traditionally thought of a lot of ways of handling inflation outside of just trying to like shut down the economy. And I think, you know, innovations there have direct benefits to those workers that also have additional benefits here. You know, things we are mentioning, like having better control over the way we're deploying green energy, to have energy costs be more stable to consumers. These are just good benefits in general. Like controlling pharmaceutical prices is a big part of this as well that's been floated. Those are good in general that also have this knockoff effect of making prices more stable and consistent across time.
Yeah, Rakeen, before you hop in, I just want to add a special question for you, which is, you know, the title of the talk is Reimagining a Fed That Works for Workers. I think, you know, a fair question. But how much of what, you know, you've been thinking about and that we're thinking about here sort of suggests like, you know, the Fed's there for a reason, and maybe in certain cases the cost of capital should be a little bit higher, a little bit lower. But what if the logical conclusion of a lot of what you've been working on is, let's de-emphasize the Fed somewhat? Why are we, you know, handing all of our problems to this institution that says itself that its tools are blunt and imperfect? So what do you make of that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, I think there's a really open and interesting set of questions around what does the role of the Fed in a inclusive, equitable, healthy economy actually look like? And I think that's a live conversation. I don't think that any of us certainly have the answers. I mean, if you two do, you should say it. But, you know, to go to where you started, I mean, the SPR example is interesting. I think it's interesting for two reasons. One is just like, I'll note, you know, we saw private corporations doing the opposite of this to make money. So we saw home builders saying, you know, it was Lenner, I think, that said, it's just one of the big home builders in the country, that said, you know, actually, it's really, really great that we're making a ton of money right now. We're just going to not build the houses we were going to build because it's going to keep prices high, and that is going to be fantastic for our bottom line. I mean, they said this on an earnings call. Same with autos. Car producers said, you know, we're just going to keep cars off the market so that we can make more money, right? So the flip side of that is happening, and I think what your example around the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is when the government releases oil onto the market when there's a shortfall to bring prices down, is an example of, which Mike really got into, is a theme of this conference in many ways, right? Which is that government has a lot of power. And I think when we sort of resort to the Fed and this really, really blunt tool that they have to bring down prices, we're sort of giving up on all of the other things that the government could be doing in order to address these crises. And, I do think that over the last year, the investments we saw in the CHIPS and Science Act, the IRA, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, these are all important starts in building more resilient supply chains, in embedding labor and childcare, labor protections and childcare, and weaving that in as part of what we do when we build a healthy economy. There's plenty of regulatory actions that we can see, right? The FTC and the DOJ both have actions that they can take to go after price gougers. They could break up these big companies that are really exploiting the situation. We could put in place a federal price gouging standard. Like, I could go on and on and on with a list of policy responses, but I think the thing that really hangs it all together is that we have a much broader toolbox than I think we've allowed ourselves to imagine. And keeping ourselves in the small Federal Reserve toolbox creates these trade-offs that are just impossible, right? It's like, either you have to lose your job and not get that raise, or prices won't come down. And that's just not true, right? That's just not what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, David?
Yeah, I was going to say a few more things that haven't been mentioned, especially when we pose the question as, why are people so vulnerable to price hikes? And then when we ask, which price hikes are people so vulnerable to? So, Tara Raghavir is in the audience, so we have to also talk about federal rent control on the agenda. Throughout the 2010s, one of the things that was pushing the relatively low inflation that was there was rent. Dean Baker advocated for rent control during the 2010s for this reason. And so I think that's a key element. I think we also have to think about other policies that will make people less vulnerable to price hikes. So in addition to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, we have to talk about public transportation. And I said, both with a certain degree of jocularity and seriousness, that we needed to have Biden buses, mass increase of bus service, free low-cost bus service across geographic areas. Where I live in Los Angeles, you could get a ton more buses on the road, and that it might not bring the price at the pump down that much, but it would mean for the people whose choice was between rent, prescription, or getting to work, they could take the bus instead.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I, depend on the subway, and it's kind of crazy to think that in the 2020s, right, in our current political environment, somebody proposing something as ambitious now. Now, of course, there's good reasons it might be a little bit harder to build the subway, right? There's, important labor laws and so on. But what I feel like, as I've been hearing all these brilliant ideas we're kicking around, and I know it's a bit of a bummer, but it just come back to political plausibility and how so much of this just seems to lack it right now, but how also it doesn't necessarily need to, right? There's ways to build coalitions for new ideas and new policy proposals. A lot of what you all do is not just, the internal sort of policy work, but then there's, rollouts and white papers and blogs and books. So, Rakeen, I'll start with you, and then we can just sort of roll down the line. How do you take these ideas that, when you're at a conference or when you're sitting around a conference table with your colleagues that you're like, oh my goodness, this would solve blank. How do you get it from there to, a bill that's signed into law in the next, let's say decade or so?
Yeah, maybe this is like a weird moment where I'm kind of optimistic. I mean, this is rare for me on a panel. I am a little bit optimistic, a little bit, and I'm cautiously optimistic. But I think, we had a panel this morning, one of the plenaries, that was all about IRA implementation and the implementation of the Biden agenda. We have seen a real pivot in the way that we've approached in response to this crisis, a way that the government has approached managing and thinking about our economy, right? We saw a massive amount of investment go into our economy. I think that is a potential sea change, and I think we have yet to see if that sea change will stick. I think we have yet to see if we can continue to build on that. And so much of what the legislative or the policy pathway forward will look like will depend on, do we get this moment right? Do we talk about it in the right way? But more importantly, do we do it in the right way, right? When we're implementing all of these incredible investments, are we making sure that, Black and brown communities and other folks who have always been left out are actually, at the table, as Venga said this morning, for rural communities? Are we making sure that, people are genuinely feeling the impact of these policies and also being aware that this didn't happen, this was an immaculate investment. It was like someone made a choice, right? And we can have a better economy. So I do think that this moment is actually one that is pretty critical in ensuring that we do get not just one sort of win in the next decade, but many, many others.
I'll jump in. I'll know two things. One is that it is a huge challenge because the advocacy space on this is very tough to sustain. It's gate kept very aggressively by economists. The coverage, notable reporters aside, most of the elite press coverage is really focused on the financial markets implications, like what does this mean for treasuries, as opposed to like what communities are going to get ripped apart for on the altar here. There is optimism, but it's a complicated optimism, and so I've been talking to a lot of people around the Hill on this, and it seems like there's more bipartisan interest in doing something about the Fed, though it pulls in very different directions, and I'm not sure what political agenda comes out of it. So you have people who are mad about the hikes, but you also have people who are mad that the Fed didn't hike more. You have Mike Pence, who's announced his candidacy, saying he wants to repeal the dual mandate. You have a lot of things that certainly look like insider trading among the regional Fed heads. I don't know legally what is what there, but certainly a lot of people are resigning or apologizing profusely for things they've done, which never attracts good attention. And obviously, regulation, the fact that, is it the CEO of Silicon Valley Bank was on the San Francisco Fed board, or whatever that web is, like, it's a bad vibe there. And notably, you have Republicans are now mad at the regional Feds for doing so-called woke research, but basically doing research into racial inequities and climate change that they can't strangle through administrative action. And the left does not like the regional Feds because they're entirely composed of bankers, electing other bankers to positions. Now, if you can get a reform bill out of that, I don't know what it looks like, and it might even be net bad, but there does seem like there's something more afoot politically there than I've seen over the past decade.
Cool. And with that, I think we'll move on to a little Q&A. I think there'll be a virtual element as well, but I think they can let me know. We might just start in the room. So anybody that has a question for one of our three wonderful panelists, now's your chance.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for this presentation. I don't have a straightforward question, but I wanted to get your guys' take on two things that are kind of happening at the same time. So I just spent the past year trying to get the minimum wage in New York State indexed to inflation. And we actually did get the bill passed, but in a really sad kind of form because people are scared of inflation now. But the reality is that 16 states in the United States have indexed their minimum wage to inflation in recent years. So that's a good thing, because it means that as prices are rising, people who are working in sectors where they're receiving minimum wage are going to get a little bit of a boost. Then we have, at the same time, a critique of the wage price spiral and plenty of evidence that you all have unearthed over the past couple of years about how that really hasn't been a factor. Even if the Fed has been constantly monitoring wage growth in their evaluation of what's going on in the economy and how to respond to it with their interest rate hikes. So I guess I'm just wondering if you guys think the minimum wage indexing to inflation at the state level kind of creates a new challenge, and if it's even on the Fed's radar. Because they're constantly kind of like looking at wages, thinking about it happening, all of this stuff in the private sector, when really we have like state law that is designed now to make sure that wages rise alongside inflation. My question is, I guess I'm just curious what you guys would all make of all of that. Thanks.
Mike, you seem eager.
So inflation aside, it's a very good idea to index the minimum wage to inflation. Even some conservative opponents of the minimum wage support that if you're going to have it, don't have it in this weird thing that only gets updated once every decade. The minimum wage is about setting the standard in low-wage labor. It's not an overall wage policy guide that I think would have the kind of theoretical spiraling or, feedback mechanism that I think people would worry about. It's not, it's not every wage, or even more importantly, the median or top half of, which is really the people who spend in the economy in the aggregate. It's not setting their wages to a certain limit. It's more setting low wage structure. In many places, low wages have increased quite rapidly. Obviously not in the same way as having a minimum wage, which would be an important regulatory tool. And yet we still see aggregate wages slowing down. So the idea that having a real, you can look at some of the research on this, a real historical compression of wages in the bottom half of the income distribution is still concurrent with overall wages slowing down towards still high levels historically, but not the kind of sky high sectorally reallocating wages. Makes me think that at the end of the day, that's not the biggest worry. And so if legislators are freaked out about, it's often going to be tough to tell what's a cynical excuse to hate the minimum wage no matter what. Because I'm sure if we were in a recession, people would say, well, no one can pay the minimum wage because we're in a recession. So I'm sure there's always an excuse to oppose it for electeds, but to the extent there's sincere worry about it, that's not really the wage dynamics that we're thinking about for people who are basically always kind of just when we think of the raw spending in the economy, it's not at that part of the economy. That's my rough take on it.
Look, the people who are worried about a wage price spiral and are thinking that the minimum wage is the driver of that, I guarantee you they're not concerned about CEO compensation driving a wage friggin' price spiral, okay? I can curse more after I get off the stage, but it's let's call that what it is, right? It's just an excuse to maintain the power dynamics that we have in our economy. That's it. And as Mike said, indexing the minimum wage to inflation is a good policy, and we should do it because it's a good policy, not because it's good or bad for inflation. We should do it because the minimum wage in this country is unconscionably low, and people can't live on that, and that does not a healthy economy make.
All right, next question.
Thank you. My name is Caitlin Schnorr. I work at the DC Fiscal Policy Institute. I have a question about job guarantees and the relationship between a federal job guarantee and inflation. So here in the district, which is where my work focuses, we do see really high rates of unemployment that are pretty inequitable, including among Black youth in particular. So we've been thinking organizationally about trying to craft a kind of local job guarantee for young people. But a lot of the research and work, I feel like, has been more at the federal or national level. So that's the background. So somewhat recently, I was giving a bit of a presentation on job guarantees. And the first question out of the audience was, but what about inflation? We can't do this, inflation. And I'm not an economist by training. My answer was kind of a vague, well, have you heard of modern monetary theory? And I'm out of my depth here. So my question is, how would you respond to a concern like that? Is it a viable concern, or is it just kind of a narrative that's entered the discourse that is kind of hard to eradicate?
I can start, which is to say that it is a very old concern. This is why in Coretta Scott King and other civil rights activists' efforts to win a federal job guarantee, they had to, come face to face with new techniques to manage inflation. Obviously, in many ways, they lost that struggle, which I think points to, I'd love to be wrong on this, but it should give us some degree of humility about what it might take to win such an effort. Fast forward to your particular question about a local DC job guarantee. I have a hard time imagining that if such policy went into place, it would cause any sense of kind of macroeconomic inflation across the country. But I also think to step back, to the extent that it might cause some degree of local inflation in the DC general region, I think it poses questions about, again, what does a fair and equitable response to inflation look like, and how can we do that beyond unemployment and the unemployment of particular people. So.
Next up.
Hi, I'm Theo Reyes with Rock United, and I've been one of the positive impacts, I guess you could say, with the pandemic is that it's eroded the monopoly power of restaurants, right? So they can't artificially depress wages, at least to the extent that they used to. And so I've been very concerned about what the Fed's impact is going to be of their effort to dampen wages. Is that going to reinstitute that? What mechanisms can we put into play to try to reduce that monopoly power for the industry? So I'd love to hear any thoughts on that from your end. But another thought is the Fed has all these regional bodies, and they're holding a conference in a few weeks in Cleveland, talking about, they have a policy summit where they're talking about quality jobs and equity and advancing all these things that at the same time they're actively depressing. And it seems like we don't have, as progressive movement, a real response to that, any type of public messaging around the Fed and their actions and this the contradictory behavior that they're trying to present as well. So, your thoughts? Thank you.
How about you, Rakeen?
So I was looking at Mike. I mean, this is probably going to be an inadequate answer because I think it's the question around wages and monopoly power and the Fed's role, and that is a really interesting one, and I will think about it and email you afterwards after I give it a bit more thought. But what we've seen with 10 consecutive rate hikes is fundamentally the Fed has been trying to erode worker agency, worker power, right? They're trying to increase unemployment, they're trying to slow down wage growth, and none of that helps workers push back against the forces that are deeply embedded in our economy that big companies and their employers have over them. And so in that framework, nothing that the Fed is doing is helping workers certainly push back against monopoly power. I think the question is, are they exacerbating the ability of these companies to take advantage of the situation and potentially squeeze even more? And I think that is true, right? And so that's what I'll say there. I don't know if others have other things they wanted to add.
I'll hop in just super quickly, and I do mean super quickly. I've spent a lot of time, particularly last year, reporting on the restaurant industry and the sort of wild degree of sudden opportunity, at least compared to the relative past that a lot of workers had, and then also how the restaurant industry was dealing with it itself, whether at the sort of small business level or the big boy level of folks that work directly with the National Restaurant Association or huge chains. I think in an accidental way, at least for now, things can always change, that there's a sort of weird truce that has been happening, just from what I'm seeing. And if you're an employer, you have to understand, right, that free markets, to the extent we have a free market, work both ways. So if the reservation wage for which is the lowest wage you're willing to accept to do an amount of work, as I'm sure you know, if that skyrockets in your industry because you don't have to work in a hot kitchen or you don't have a demanding boss that's very frivolous about when they may or may not give you shifts, and instead you can make as much money and maybe have health care doing something else, then even with Fed policy, there's going to be an impetus for that employer, hopefully enthusiastically, but maybe begrudgingly, to have to adjust their operating costs so that they can pay people closer to maybe $20 an hour or more. So that's the hopeful case I've been seeing. But of course, there's definitely a lot of inequity in the industry, and I'm sure you'll be right in the muck of those debates. But Mike, did you have anything to add?
No, just basically what you said. The compression's been real. It's one reason I think I'm optimistic about a continued slowdown in inflation, is just simply that a lot of the non-housing services, the inflation there has been actually pretty contained, as much as everyone's been really worried about it. And I think part of it's because it's been this real shift within bosses and workers, as opposed to bosses and workers conspiring to send prices to consumers. And And I think that's really optimistic. And it was sort of a case in point of what we had been arguing for a long time, is that you can have these real impacts on wages without impacting employment. In fact, if anything, bringing up employment, as we've seen in some argued cases for the minimum wage, and in particular through this tight labor market policy.
Next up, maybe Mark. Oh, that's, the person I was questioning?
Yeah, it's me.
I'm so sorry. I thought you were handing it out. Okay, thank you.
It's all good.
What's up, sir?
Hi, Charles. I work at CPD. So when I think about like worker power and the well-being of workers, I think like people in this room think about the ability of government to, even outside of wages or worker benefits, to improve the life of workers. And I think like a problem that governments often run into, or they say they're running into, is a lack of resources. That's why like my core thing is tax policy. But when we were going through the pandemic, there was sort of this like very slim light at the end of the tunnel, with the Federal Reserve offering to like fund governments, right? And the program ended up being essentially not worth local governments like accessing it because of the way that it was structured. But I also found at the time that there was actually a lack of initiative from state and local leaders to really like advocate for that being a thing. And as people in this room know, like the Federal Reserve floats banks, and then those banks eventually lend to states and they make their money on top. So the question is sort of like, what would it take to get the Federal Reserve to actually start to lend money to state and local governments? Because that would create like a massive amount of like low-cost resources that could actually fund some of the infrastructure programs and lots of other programs that could really benefit workers that often just, you know, states say they don't. It would just make it easier to spend the money on it.
Great question. And that's the municipal lending facility for those in the virtual room who might be wondering. You all?
I have the off-brand take, so you should go.
So I'll talk about a few things about the MLF as well as funding, the municipal liquidity facility, as well as funding state and local governments. So one, not to route everything through the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, but that's, you know, kind of my brand. So an early draft of the Humphrey-Hawkins Act called for basically automatic countercyclical stabilizers for states and municipalities. So, you know, an automatic federal grant provision where, you know, recession hits, the federal government makes up state and local budgets. So state and localities don't have to, you know, either go by the vagaries of the bond market or lay off librarians and teachers during a recession. So this also made its way into the 1976 Democratic Party platform. I think we need to resuscitate this provision and create it so that, you know, states and localities won't be left with whatever kind of big, you know, kind of the best case scenario coming out of 2020 was a ton of money, you know, for states and municipalities, which is now drying up. And so I think there's that component for funding state and local government. And then I think there's also a need to fight for a permanent expansion of the MLF, both to stabilize state and local bond markets and lower rates so states and localities can engage in kind of big green spending that isn't determined by whatever's happening in Congress, and, you know, ideally also kind of, you know, undermine the municipal bond market, which, you know, as my friend and colleague Destin Jenkins shows in his wonderful book, Bonds of Inequality, has been, you know, rife with the history of racist inequities. And so I think, you know, that's kind of, you know, 1.5 cheers for the MLF, which, you know, it also is important kind of who the Fed put in charge of the MLF, the guy who designed the PROMESA provisions in the Puerto Rican junta. So, you know, it also kind of, you know, as everyone in this room knows far better than I do, you know, personnel is policy.
I'll go off-brand for the groups on this. I actually think it's important to understand the ways the MLF was a success, which is to say that it lowered the interest rates that municipalities faced. There's I think, very convincing work on this. This is the kind of work financial economists do really well, which is like look at bonds and see like what things are different. And after the MLF was set up very poorly. It was set up not to target where it was needed and had far too high of a penalty rate. But once it was introduced, and then again when it reduced its penalty rate a little bit later, you saw that the rates municipalities could borrow at dropped pretty dramatically, consistent with the Fed just lowering interest rates in general. It lowered interest rates to general, like in general to zero, and then did this thing which basically lowered them further for municipalities. The Fed had a program for corporations as well, secondary market, CCF, which did a similar thing, which like was open to corporations and didn't do very much lending. It bought a very, very, very small amount of bonds, but lowered the rates corporations faced quite dramatically in that March to June period. And that same effect happened with MLF in the same way. Now, I think the reason it was such a contentious thing is because the CARES Act didn't have state and municipal funding in it, which was like the big fight that the Dems failed to secure. Notably failed to secure it when they re-upped, now we're going in the weeds, PPP that summer, which was their one vulnerable point where they could have demanded state and local funding that had to sadly wait a full year to the American Rescue Plan. I think there's ways to automate fiscal transfers to the states in crises. They do it a little bit ad hoc through like Medicaid reimbursement rates and things like that, that could be formalized much more dramatically. One thing I worry a little bit about the MLF, which I was a huge supporter of and advocated for, is that at the end of the day, you're not really transferring fiscal resources. You're giving municipalities a lower rate to borrow at, which is a transfer in an important sense, but not actual money you can hand to someone to do emergency services or fund shortfalls. And so, you know, I think we want to look just as much on the fiscal side as in addition to the federal side on that, or Federal Reserve side on that.
Thank you, Mike. I think if we're going to move on to virtual questions. How can I help with that? Do you want to just take it from there? All right, sweet.
This is from Lydia Brunn, one of our virtual participants. She says, so they've been talking a lot about how we need to understand the sources of inflation so that not to use a blunt tool that affects the economy in a very broad sense, instead of government influencing certain markets in a targeted way. But I feel all of the alternatives discussed about alternative policies were on the non-monetary side of government. But the Fed is also the government, and the two big crises of the past decade have also brought in the tools of monetary policy making. What do you feel about the possibilities of making a green monetary policy with monetary policy making conditional on financial sector targets for green investments, de-risking certain assets, et cetera? Do you see the Fed doing this? The ECB is talking about it.
Go for it. Maybe Rakeen?
I was just going to say that's a big question, Lydia, and also, hey, it's nice. I'm glad you're watching, but I don't know. I don't know if my co-panelists have any specific questions, answers here.
Well, the spirit of that is a lot of what the Inflation Reduction Act wants to do through essentially large fiscal stimulus to make green energy zero or even negative, certainly compared. There is a very strong debate about the ability of the Federal Reserve to do those kinds of regulations on its own outside of an act of Congress. You know, it's a very long story, but to the extent we are using government policy, that is a very important goal of government policy, is to move investments towards green energy compared to dirty energy. There's a lot of regulatory tools to do that. I'm of two minds of doing it through the Fed. One is the statutory authority compared to the EU is tough, and the Fed hates it, where other parts of the government would like to be making loans to green entities. And so there's a big question about that, which is a giant punt, which is to say that to the extent we do it, the Fed can't do that alone. We would want other entities to move with it.
Okay. With that, I think we've run out of time for questions, but obviously I think these three will still be hanging out, so feel free to catch them out the door. And I think hopefully you all will stay for the keynote, the closing keynote of the conference. So thanks for coming.
Just as a heads up, you all are going to be going to the elevation room upstairs in the roof, and there are refreshments up there if you want a snack.